Thank you. I feel kind of sassy.
I'm like sassy.
Thank you. You too.
Well,
No, that's just me. That's me.
Oh, okay.
So I
There we go.
like to kind of be close.
There's nowhere to sit. I guess I'm gonna have to go back to work. There's a stool over here.
It's always now it's 10.
She's like, this is wrong. I'm like, well, my inspector looked at that task 9 years ago. You must find actual evidence.
Welcome you to the first Equity for Everyone sponsored event. Super excited to introduce our speaker for this morning. Koen is an energetic presenter, a powerful communicator.
Read the short form.
Okay,
Embarrassed.
now I'm gonna read it all.
Okay.
It's really good. A powerful communicator, a dynamic teacher. His educational influence spans the North American continent. Andre integrates his abilities as an improvisational comedian. I can't believe I got that right this early. Large group facilitator, keynote speaker, and classroom teacher to captivate and educate his audience. There are many words that define Mr. Andre Koen: educator, student, I can't say it the second time. Improvisational comedian, speaker, activist, facilitator, coach, mentee, mentor, leader, team member, community organizer, diversity trainer, motivator, friend, and son. The most representative, however, is Andre, the enkindled spirit. Please welcome Mr. Andre Koen.
It's always uncomfortable to hear words that you wrote. The majority of that is marketing and true. Right? So, I'm humbled and I'm excited to be here in this space with you. You could have elected to have someone else do this session, but you saw fit that this was the right time for us to meet and for us to join together. So I take that very seriously. I walk into this room with privilege and power. I walk into this room with privilege and power. I'm African American. I prefer the term black. I am a cisgendered male, which means my gender identity and my biology are congruent. I have matriculated through institutions of higher education, and I have initials after my last name that certify my position. And I'm not sure if I'm upper lower class or lower middle class, but that's my kind of social economic space. I am a conservative Christian. I am 6'2". I'm mildly attractive and extremely humble. So what I know about all of those things is that given whatever context that I'm in, some of those things give me access that other people don't have. And some of those things are barriers that I have to overcome given the context. And so, although I was speaking about my privilege and power, I also want you to think about your privilege and power. Because if we're not mindful of our privilege and power, it can become a weapon used to undermine other people's approaches to life, and even their humanity, to undermine their humanity. And so I recognize that. I also recognize that I'm my father's son. And usually when I'm doing bad things, that's what my mother says. Right? But in 1968, something happened in the life of my parents that changed the trajectory of their life. And what one event do you think could have happened to my parents in 1968 that changed how they saw the world?
You were born.
They had a son? No, not quite. Although that is monumental. As my grandfather would say, it's a poor dog that can't wag his own tail, right? I don't know what that means. No, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so my parents were 18 years old. They were graduating from high school. My dad goes to my grandfather and says, I want to do something about the assassination of Dr. King. And my grandfather says, great, do it someplace else. Because my grandfather was one of these individuals who grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and his strength and his ability to resist his revolution was keeping his head down and doing what he needed to do to raise his family. And so for my father to try to kick up all this dirt and all this stuff, my grandfather was supportive, but he that was not his way. And so my father went off to college in Indiana and became a Black Panther. Now, not the movie, not the movie. So I don't know what you know about the Black Panther political party, or what you think you know, or what you've heard. But primarily, they were a political party that was designed to raise people out of poverty, and specifically Black people out of poverty. And so, not understanding what the foot of the United States felt like on a small rebel group, my father found it advantageous to depart from the Panther Party as a method of survival. I find it interesting that many of us are impacted or have been impacted by some of the things that the Panther Party produced, right? So please raise your hand if you had lunch or breakfast at school, right? One of the Panther Party's major tenets was making sure that kids were fed before they went into the classroom. And so the federal government also adopted that. We also know that in rural places, that was also a practice, particularly in one-room schoolhouses, right? And so the Panthers recognized that and made that one of the tenets of their platform. And so my father is compelled by the oppression that is coming against the Panther Party to find another way. And as he's searching for this way, he gets a call from God. Now, I don't know what you would do if God called you, but if God called you, what might one do? answer, right? Is that you? Oh my goodness, I better take this, right? And so he became an evangelical, Pentecostal, fire and brimstone preacher. And I am my father's son. So it might feel like you're getting preaching. It's not my fault. Blame my father, right? And it might feel like we're getting socially active or I have a political stance. I want you to know that I do. I have a political leaning. And it's called the Constitution of the United States. That's what I lean on. And so we'll explore those things together. And then just for, this is extra, this is for free. I also will be coming from a place of, or a methodology referred to as critical race theory. Is anyone familiar with critical race theory? All right. So some of the language that you'll hear may be familiar to you, and it's a tool that I think we all can use. And I'll go through that theory a little bit later in more depth in just a bit. So I know why I'm here. I have a presentation. I have handouts. If people want a PowerPoint, I can get that to them. We won't be using that in this session because I think the human aspect is enough entertainment for us. Just by looking at some of you, you look very entertaining. So I know why I'm here, but I'm curious as to what you were hoping that we might get out of this session. Why did you come to this particular session, and what were you hoping that we might discuss or talk about? I'm going to just write some notes as you talk about what some of your expectations or your hopes were for this session.
Nobody say because Rhonda put it on.
Right, that's a given. That is a given, right? Yes. So I'm not sure what to do with that.
I'm excited about it though.
Okay. Externally excited. All right, cool. Yes.
Well, I'm hoping that this gives us all a starting point with language that we can begin our exploration of equity issues.
I am open to learning how race impacts the world I live in. We should never stop us, whether we think we're there, whether there is in the world.
Yes.
Because we're gathered here as a staff, I'm hoping we can learn tools and aspects of this topic that help us be better with each other.
I'm just hoping that we can start building on the course and start a dialogue and be able to talk to one another openly.
Anyone else? Yes.
But I hope everyone has a dialogue together and experience together and get to connect with each other and not just one at a time, but really develop a relationship.
What? All right, what's that?
Those are all the extroverts.
Those are all the extroverts, right? So one of the tricks, and maybe I should have thought about this, that I also do is for those introverts who don't want to, I usually have in my PowerPoint people text in questions or comments, and I should have thought about that, but I didn't. So forgive me for that, but we'll find a way for those introverts to kind of share their hopes and dreams. Also, are there things, though, that you were hoping we would not talk about? Like, if I hear this thing one more time, my head is going to explode. I do not want to hear this or talk about this. Yes?
Kanye West.
Kanye West. My whole presentation. So Kanye West. So some people are like, who? So we will not talk in great detail about Kanye. Anything else? Yeah, anything else? And people are like, I really don't want to talk about this, or we've really hashed this over. The president. Okay. The president. Okay. Cool. Anything else? All right, cool. This is on the table. I'm glad you said the president because that was going to come up, but because he's related to Kanye. I don't know. So, that's half my presentation right there. Yeah. So I want to. So I believe in choose your own adventure. So how would you like to start this? Would you like to start with just kind of easing into the workshop, or do you just want to jump right in and cannonball? Oh. All right. So I hear jump in. I did not hear a whole lot of let's ease into this. Those are the introverts, right? And so I should listen to your silence. That's what I should do. Right? So does everyone have a handout? I just want to make sure everyone has a handout. And does everyone have something to write with?
Okay, I'll grab something.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That was something I probably should have said earlier, but I didn't. So I love I love marketing, and I love so. Just so you know, where I come from. So I am a professor at Bethel University, outside of doing my consulting pieces, and I teach a course called Educational Equity. And so these are all pre-service teachers that I'm preparing to go into the classroom and teach all of our students. And our class focuses on three groups in particular: African Americans, Native Americans, and people with disabilities. And in relationship to that, we can't not talk about other groups as well, right? So context is everything. I was also the affirmative action officer for Anoka County, and I'm not sure if so when I applied, I didn't know where Anoka County was, and that wasn't my biggest challenge. My challenge was I didn't know what time Anoka County was in until so my time at Anoka County was very well spent. I learned a lot. I grew as an individual. My time as a middle school and high school teacher really helped shape me. So there's nothing you can do or not do to me that I haven't experienced as a middle school and high school teacher. So I am ready to go. So one thing I'd like for you to do is, if you could, one thing I'd like for you to do, if you could, is on the front of your paper there are 5 circles. What I'd like for you to do is I want you to put one thing that you value or that is important to you in each one of those circles. One thing that is important to you or of value to you in each one of those circles. All right? So, so the 5 gray circles. One thing that is of value or important to you. So it could be a place, like Belize or Bemidji. It could be a person, like a significant other or a grandchild. It could be a thing, like a boat or a cabin home. It could be a concept like freedom or justice. Yes?
Are you not looking for us
I want you to, whatever is of value to you. So write down whatever is of value to you. Yep, so there are 5. There are 5. All right, now that it looks like at least up this way, most people have gotten 4, if not all 5. And this isn't, deep word association, just whatever comes on the top of your head. Right? So what I like to do now is I like to play a game. And the game is very simple. What I want you to do is I want you to find 2 people for each one of the things that you wrote down. And I want you to find individuals who either agree with what you have on your paper or they have something similar to what you have on your paper. So they look at your paper and say, oh, that is a really great idea. And they put their signature on that. All right? So I want you to find 2 people for each one of the things. So you have 5 things. You are to have a minimum of how many people?
10.
A minimum of 10 signatures for those things. You have 90 seconds to do that starting now. 60 seconds!
Yeah.
like getting so much community work,
Four, three, two, one. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. If you can hear my voice, clap 3 times. If you can hear my voice, clap 4 times. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So one of the one of the things that I talked about in my high school teaching, that the most disrespectful thing that one human can say to another human is to shut up. Why? What's that? Because you're not listening. What else? You're saying that the person doesn't matter, and what they have to say doesn't matter. So what I've also recognized is that in this age of texting, there are lots of shortcuts that we use to do that. And one of those for shut up is shh. Right? So I try not to do that. So I do clapping things. I hope you don't find that elementary. It is a facilitation skill that I love because I think it honors people coming into a space together, right? So as we collectively get our understanding, and people are in different spaces and all that kind of stuff, and so that collectively gets us back into a space together. Where other methods that people have used oftentimes do the opposite. Blame, shame, and guilt, I don't think motivate people very well. At least I've never been motivated by them in a positive direction. They have pushed me to do things I really didn't want to do, but I did it just because somebody was trying to guilt me or fault me into doing something. But that's a whole other thing. My therapist and I, we're working on that. Something to do with my Christian upbringing. So I'm curious. Is there anyone that was participating that did not get any signatures at all? So your paper is totally blank. All right, great. So everybody at least got one signature. Is that a fair assumption? All right, cool. As you were walking around the room and you were looking at other people's papers, were there things you saw on other people's papers and you were like, oh man, why didn't I think of that? I should have wrote that down. What were some of those things?
Well, as a woman of color, I didn't put culture down.
You didn't put a culture down. Okay, cool. Music. You saw that and you were like, I value music. Yes, there's a hand over here. Faith. You saw that and you didn't write that down. Yes. Travel. You were just saying something. Justice. All right. So it's obvious there were things that we saw that we didn't get to sign on. Can folks count up the number of signatures that you got? Because I'm just curious as to what kinds of numbers. And you can have duplicate signatures. I just want to know the number of signatures that folks have. 15? Or 17? 18? 22? 25? Wow, we have a lot of overachievers up in here, right? So I understand why we're on the 24th floor, right? So cool. Were there actually things that you weren't able to find, that you weren't able to get signed, that people had actually, it was either difficult or you weren't able to find people to sign? Yes. Minneapolis. Please raise your hand if you value Minneapolis, even if it wasn't on your paper, right? Yeah. We're going to cross that great divide. Cool. Yes. Please raise your hand if you value food. All right. Cool. Yeah. Work. please, please raise your hand if you value work. That's important, specifically when the boss is in the room. What's that?
We only have 5 circles.
We only have 5 circles, right? And we'll address that. We'll address that. That was purposeful as well, right? So, what do you think was the intention or the purpose of playing this particular game? Yes. To see what we have in common with other people.
To see what other people value.
To see what other people value. To insert some energy into the room. To realize that we're a lot more alike than we are different. I know that when I've walked into spaces to do trainings or to receive trainings, which is interesting because no one ever trained me to do anything, so I'm not sure how we call these trainings, but that's the language we have to use, right? I like experiences, but anyway, but oftentimes the sessions are coordinated to talk about our differences or our commonalities. And what I would like to suggest, and I hope we experience this today, that it is both of those that are working in concert that give us a better understanding of each other. There are ways in which we are very much alike. Very much alike. But there are also ways in which we are very different. And it's recognizing those differences and those commonalities that I come to a new understanding about diversity. I think diversity is that. It's the recognition, it's the honoring, it's the understanding of our commonalities and our differences. Those of you who've done like the IDI may recognize some of that language coming from a place of minimization. I have a different kind of tweak on that, in that I think that we have to come to some basic understanding about our common humanity. And so that will set up the rest of our conversation, is that we are very much alike and we are very much different. And it's okay. It's okay. So there's that. I want to get to any questions, comments, observations on that particular piece. Wonderful. Oh, yes. We'll come back to the middle circle. Right? So just like my grandmother said, you don't give away all your good stuff on the first date. So we got a little ways to go. We got a little ways to go. So it brings me down to this. This next part reminds me of a story that some of you may be able to relate to or not. So my family was really big into holidays, and we would always dress up and go take pictures as a family around holidays. A big one was Easter. And so we would go to this place called Olin Mills Studio. I don't know if you all right, cool. So you know what I'm talking about, right? So we went to Olin Mills Studio, and for whatever reason, they were known for like this oatmeal gray background. Like it was, and in the early days, they would just kind of line us up. But then towards the end of, their existence, I don't think they're still around, are they? So towards the end of their existence, they tried to get hip with the modern technology. So what they would do is they'd have us sit and, take a family photo this way, and then they'd make us turn this way, take another family photo, and then they would superimpose the two photos, right? So it's really like psychedelic. Like, it's like, what are they doing, So we had the superimpose thing, and so I was excited. I had one last one. I was excited, and every time we went to Olin Mill and we got the picture back. Now, this was a time when you took a picture and you had to wait to see the results of that picture, right? So when I got married, it was funny. We hired somebody from Craigslist to take our pictures. He took 1,200 pictures. He was a new photographer, right? So he used the law of averages to recognize that he's gonna get something that's good, and so we took a risk, right? But at Olin Mills, you had to wait, right? So we would wait for weeks. This wasn't like an instant thing. This was like weeks, and then they had to put it up on the big board. I don't know if you had the big painting stuff, the family stuff, and so we had to wait. And so I was excited when the pictures came, right? And who do you think I looked for when the pictures came? I looked for me first. I was like, oh man, why did they pick that one? I should have smiled more, smiled less, or whatever. Or I should have wore something different. But I critiqued myself when I saw the picture because that's what I did. So one of the things I want us to think about is, what if in year one, the pictures come back, we all were dressed there, I was there, everybody was there, and year one, the pictures come back, and my face is blurry. What might I say about that whole process? I may not want to do that again. Now, everybody else in the picture is clear, but I'm blurry. What might I say about that? So I might ask to find a different photographer. I might be asking, why is it just me that's blurry?
Maybe you were moving to this and not moving.
And maybe it was me. Maybe I was moving and everybody else wasn't, right? So yes.
I would probably say that's not fair. Everybody else looks good. But
You'd say that's not fair. Everybody else looks good, but I don't, right? And my inclination would be to blame the process, right? Or there's something that happened in the process. Either I was moving or whatever, and I'll give them a mulligan. Okay, so year 2 and 3 and 4, the same thing keeps happening. What do I start to think about this process? It sucks. Excuse my French. That it's personal. It might be about me. And after about 5 or 6 years of this, I might actually start having a complex about me and pictures.
I don't look good in pictures. They never turn out. It's me. It's me.
Because everybody else is fine, right? What I want us to think about is, what's the picture that we're creating? Do you mind if I move on this just a second? So let's go to this idea of the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and the securing of blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Declaration of Independence, paragraph 2. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Anybody else get warm and fuzzy when you hear those words? I get warm and fuzzy when I hear those words, right? And it's interesting because I have brothers and sisters who say, well, Andre, when they wrote those words down, they wasn't talking about you. And I said, agree. I'll take that. However, they wrote them down, and I can read. It applies to me, right? It applies to me. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting is that those are beautiful words. Those are beautiful aspirations. Those are beautiful movements that we're trying to make. But as those words are being penned on the paper that they were printed on, what is also happening? The transatlantic slave trade is happening. What else is happening? Native American genocide or indigenous peoples genocide. Right? Women don't have equal rights either. Now, this is what I think is funny. So I am, again, the Constitution is that's where I get my meat, and anybody who disagrees with that, you hit the road, right? But I find it interesting that there is a political movement or party, I'm not sure how they call themselves, the Tea Party. And they pride themselves off of an event that is directly related to what we're talking about. And so the Tea Party's movement is, less taxes, blah, 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 blah. But does anyone remember what happened at the Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party? These great patriots who wanted great things for this great country dressed up like Indians, quote unquote, to do their patriotic duty of dumping this tea into the bay. When we look at those great words and we think about those great ideas, there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect. And so one of the things that I want us to think about is I want us to think about social justice in a different kind of way. Because people try to crouch it as if it is some soft, snowflakey kind of thing to think or talk about social justice. I'm a simple guy. I work with middle schoolers. I needed to make things simple for me so that I could explain it to them. And so when I think about social justice is about bringing everyone into the picture. Because when those words were penned, who was not a part of that picture? He said most everyone, right? So white, male, landowners were who those pictures were designed to, or designed for. However, they wrote it down. They applied it to this great nation. I'm a child of that great nation, so those words apply to me. Which means that I don't want special treatment. I don't need any special programs. Just give me what is my birthright. And so all those great words, that's my birthright. And those are folks who either use this as their birth nation or their adopted nation have that as their birthright. And so when we talk about social justice, it's not just this touchy-feely thing. It really is about how do we get people back into the picture that oftentimes they were left out of. So there's that. So let's flip over to the next page. So there are 4 truths about human beings that we have to understand, particularly as we try to move forward. We start talking about this idea of race, and we talk about this idea of equity. And I'm going to talk about intersectionality. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that, but we can't talk about race without talking about intersectionality. And so I'll get to that in just a second. But there are 4 truths. The first truth is that human beings can learn, change, and grow. So if you go to page 2, it's towards the corner, you'll see those things, right? So do we have to see evidence of people's changing, learning, or growing for that to be a true statement? We don't have to see evidence, right? So there are things, behaviors, ways that I thought about the world when I was 16, and my parents were like, I wish he would stop doing that. One of those things was I would walk, I would drag my feet when I walked. I kind of shuffle like this, and it's amazing that what you do when you start buying your own clothes. So stop doing it. Was it on my parents' timeline? Did they want me to, did they want me to stop earlier? Certainly, but it was at my own time, right? So people can learn, change, and grow, even if we don't see evidence of it. I recall I wasn't always a good teacher. I will be honest about that. I was not always a good teacher. And I thought I had disposable students. There were some students that I actually thought were not going to be successful in life, and I treated them as such. Now, I was fair, but I did not give them my best. And the most compelling thing was when they reached out to me, when this particular student reached out to me on Facebook. She said, Andre, I want to thank you for all the things that you said to me in your class. And then she quoted some of the stuff that she's an adult now with her own family, and she reflected on my worst, what I thought was my worst, but for her it was her best. And I just thought about, what if I had given her my best? If this is what she was able to get out of my worst, what if I give her my best? And so people can learn, change, and grow. You never know who's watching you. You never know who is paying attention to you. So always do your best. And that's a personal thing. Next is that people do what they think works even when what? Even when it doesn't work. But why are they doing things things that are not yielding results? Why are they doing those things? Out of habit, out of comfort,
Fear.
that's out of fear, that's what they were taught. Ignorance. Sanity. Trying to balance sanity, right? Now, the funny thing is, since I taught middle school, I hear everything, but I don't respond to everything. So, you know, if you chime up just a little bit, I'll hear you. So Mr. Adrian Peterson got caught up in this concept, right? So when he was working for the Vikings, he had to take time off of his job. Does anyone remember why he had to take time off of his job? Yep. So and I think the proper term is he whooped. I don't know how you spell it, but he whooped his child. Now, when Mr. Adrian Peterson was asked why did he use that form of discipline, what was his response? Because that's how I was disciplined. So people do what they oftentimes do because they thought that it was effective. But what did Mr. Adrian Peterson fail to realize about his upbringing and now the upbringing of his child? Context is different. Context is different. So when my wife says, wait till my daughter, wait till your daddy gets home, that's me, right? She's talking about me. And so I come, I get a text, I know what the whole layout is. I come into the room, I'm ready to make stuff happen. I have Zeus's lightning bolts in one hand, I have Thor's hammer in the other hand, and this little girl is gonna get it. And so I come into the house and I said, little sister, what did you do? And she looks at me and she says, I'm not your sister. I'm like, you're gonna get it. Go to your room for 2 minutes. This hurts me more than it hurts you. Google set a timer for 2 minutes. Right, that's the third parent in my household. But why do I do that? Why do I use that type of discipline for my daughter? Because the world requires different things of her today, and of me as a parent than it did back in the day, right? I don't know if the brutalness that parents used to use in terms of using physical discipline was effective or not. I can't say, but I will say that many folks got that from environments that were brutal, that people typically will start to repeat things that, particularly as a child, that they may not even know why those things occurred. And so I found it very, almost criminal to hold Mr. Peterson accountable for a generational thing that was taught by people who snatched and stole people and taught them how to do that. Right? So I'm glad that he was able to get counseling. I'm glad he was able to get his job back, and now he's somewhere else. Right? I don't know where he is now. But that he was able to kind of carry it on with his life. The next is that all human behavior is goal directed. So when people engage in a behavior, we must recognize that it is goal focused, even if they can't articulate it or don't want to articulate what that goal is. Right? You ever had a child take a cookie or a piece of candy? And what silly thing do adults ask the child? Why did you do that, right? Now, the funny thing is, you know why they did it. The child knows why they did it, so they want to save you. They want to save face for you. And what do they tell you when you ask them why they did it? I don't know, right? And we usually cut them off before they can finish the statement, because the statement is, I don't know why you're asking me that. Right? So all human behavior is goal directed. So it's important to recognize what is the goal of human behavior. Um, so, what is the goal of human behavior? Next is that an attitude is a response to a goal. That an attitude is a response to a goal, which means that an attitude is a side effect and not the primary issue. So, an attitude. So, what have you been taught about an attitude? What is an attitude? It's generally negative. What's that?
It's your outlook.
It's your outlook. Could be positive. I'm looking at some of y'all. Y'all got attitude right now. Yeah.
I think attitude is your approach. How do you want to look at it? I want to see the world.
All right. You guys are brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yes. It's usually external. All right. So all of your answers are great answers, but they would have been inadequate for my parents. My parents went to old school. Right? Yeah. Fix your attitude, right? I'll never forget my dad we were somewhere and he did something and I didn't appreciate it. And he looks at me, he said, "Boy, you better fix your face." Right? And so I did. I went. And then he sent me to my room. My mother would be like, I don't like your attitude. Go to your room till you get your act together. So I get in my room, I get my act together, I step out into the hallway. To be or not to be. Right? I spent a lot of time in my room. But it wasn't until I was 17 that I finally got what they were talking about. And so I think I mentioned before, my dad was my pastor, so he was a preacher growing up. And so on Sunday, we would go to church from 7:30 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. We stop at 3 o'clock for chicken, not because we're black, but because chicken is delicious. So all day church on Sunday. So Friday night, I go to my dad, I say, "Dad, can I borrow the car?" What does my dad say? Because he loves me. What does he say? No. Oh, he says, yes, he loves me. So I get the keys to the car, I pick up my friends, we're cruising for girls. I don't know what would have happened had we found girls. I fill up the car with gas, I come home before curfew, I give my dad the keys, and what does he say about my attitude? That it's a good attitude, right? So Friday night, my dad and I are cool. We're good. Sunday, my best friend Dexter calls me at noon and says, "Andre, can you pick me up for the movies?" What do I know about Sunday? Church all day. But I'm 17. I'm invincible. And Jesus is my friend. So I go to my dad and I say, "Dad, can I borrow the car?" And what does my dad say? No. Not only does he say no, but he gives me the sermon. In our household, the worst consequence you could get ever was going to hell. And either you could go to hell on your own, or my dad would show you the way. As a result of that interaction, what would I say? What was my attitude as a result of that interaction? I had a bad attitude, right? So what is it that actually determines one's attitude? Day of the week. External forces. All right, let's dial this back. Anyone have a teenager in your life? Anyone remember being a teenager? Right? Okay, so here's a scenario. Teenager. Mom, have you been working out? What do you want? Marcia just texted. She's got her party is starting in 5 minutes. I was just wondering if you could drop me off. Oh, you were buttering me up. That's what it was. No, you can't go to Marcia's party. Your room isn't clean. You've been fighting with your brothers and sisters. You got a singing gym. 2 years ago, you asked me for this. No, you can't go. What happens to the kid's attitude? They transform. Transformers. So they go storm off, right? And then the parent's like, "Oh, I just unloaded on this kid. Marcia does need her support. I love Marcia's family. She should be with Marcia." So you know what? I'm gonna let her go. So the parent goes to the door. What are you? Why? I was just thinking you can go to Marsha's party. You can't stay the whole time. I'll drop you off here. We got some other stuff to do. I'll pick you up at this time. So get your stuff. Let's go. What happens to the attitude? It changes, right? It may not it's been as sweet as you know, when you birth the child, but it is certainly a better attitude. So what is it that actually drives or determines one's attitude? The goal, right? When you get what you want, you have a good attitude. When you don't get what you want, you have a bad attitude. So when people have a bad attitude, whether it's an employee, a community member, what are they telling you with that attitude? Before they even open their mouths, what is their attitude telling you? I am not getting what I want, right? And the easiest thing to do to help someone change their attitude is to give them what they want, particularly if it's possible. And if you can't give them what they want, it's important for you to help them to help them. I see food, so I'm a little distracted. But to help them find a new goal, right? So to help them find a new goal. So an attitude is a side effect of goal accomplishment. So what is it that people are after? What are the goals of human beings? What are people after? They're after safety, significance, and belonging. I think you can find that on page 3. Safety, significance, and belonging. And so when we go back to those 5 circles that we had before, I'm curious as to how safety, significance, and belonging play in that. So if we can just flip back to your first circle, because I'm also curious, and I'm sorry, sir, what's your name, sir? Larry. So Larry alluded, he was trying to steal my punchline, but Larry alluded to something that was important for us to recognize. So when we look at those 5 circles, is there any particular circle that would identify your racial or ethnic background as it might be noted on an HR form? Is there anything there that has something to do with your racial or ethnic background that might be identified on the HR form? No. Okay. So the majority of people said no. Some people didn't say anything, but that's cool. That's cool. Is there anything out of your 5 circles? Is there a particular thing that would denote your gender identity, your gender expression, that would be specifically pointed to your gender identity? So if you can raise your hand if that is true. So we have about 4 people out of 60 or so, right? So interesting. Now for this one, what I want you to do is I want you to jump up and wave your hands in the air like you don't care. If you can say yes to this. Is there anything in those 5 circles that denotes your IRS tax bracket that would indicate your social economic status, if you will? Okay. So why is it that for the majority of us, and I say the majority of us because I can see in people's eyes that some, introverts, extroverts, all that stuff. But for the majority of us, why is it that the 5 things that we wrote down, that either our race or our ethnicity wasn't one of those things, that our gender or gender identity wasn't one of those things, or our social economic status wasn't one of the things that rises to the top when we look at those 5 things? Why do you think that was? Because we're getting what we want, okay? So most of the time they may be invisible.
I think it's how you ask the question.
So it's how I asked the question.
You have to ask us to pick out things that are important to us, and it does say 5 important aspects of my identity, and sometimes when these kinds of things you're asked is how you identify yourself, and then that's when some of those things come up. So
Yeah.
just the framing maybe?
So the framing may be. Why do you think those things didn't come up? Yeah.
I'm trying to shorten it down, but I guess I'm thinking that some of those identities are not valued by others, and so you stop valuing yourself. Or if you do value in yourself, it might be an identity that is your privilege, so you can stand on the piece of paper.
So embarrassment, right? So there may be identities that people are embarrassed to say that they value, or they're identities that you stop valuing in public, right? So you may value those privately. Yes.
Kind of echo that and say value others more than ourselves.
Okay, so maybe we value others more than ourselves. All right? Cool. I'll tell you why. I'll let you off the hook. Because you're smart. What did I ask us to do?
Put down 5 important things in our life.
5 things that
You value.
we value. Now, I'm not suggesting that my African American heritage or my blackness isn't something that I value, but I do find it interesting that the things that folks did write down are things that we all value in some way or another, right? And so you wrote down things that are important and valuable to you. And I would suggest that our so-called racial or ethnic considerations or categories or whatever are less valuable to us in the grand scheme of things than they are to the institutions who want to use those things for their own purposes. And so I'll just spill the beans. I was not born black. I know some of you are surprised by that, but it's okay. It's okay. I'm not going to reverse Michael Jackson thing. No. When I was born in 1970 in Dayton, Ohio, the doctors used to do really archaic and barbaric things. So when I was born, the doctor hung me upside down and he slapped me. And I did what any self-respecting young man would do. And I slapped the doctor back. That's an old Richard Pryor joke and probably the only one I can tell. So he hands me off to the nurse. The nurse does some interesting things. She takes my vitals, puts me on this cold scale, and then she takes my foot ID. I don't know if you've ever been asked for your foot ID, but I've never been asked for that, right? So she takes my foot and she stamps it on a piece of paper. I tried to use it once at the bank. I said, "No, it's me, really." So she does that, and then she gets to the part of the list that changes my life forever. And so she looks at her category, and is the category of race. And there are 3 categories for her to choose from: black, white, and other. So she looks at me, she looks at her list, she looks at my parents, she looks at me, she looks at her list, and she makes her decision. What decision do you think she makes? Black. But what I find intriguing is, what was I before she made that distinction? I was born human, but America made me black. If I was born in Haiti, I would be different than if I was born on the other side of the island, the Dominican Republic, right? If I was born in Brazil, I would be something different. If I was born in South Africa, I would be something different. If I was in Spain, I would be something different. And so it's important for us to recognize that a number of these kind of so-called racial categories are actually optical illusions. Optical illusion. Artificial barriers to authentic human relations. And these optical illusions were needed and necessary to make sense of a world that didn't make sense, particularly here in the United States of America. Because as people were fighting for freedom, we were holding freedom from other folks. So we needed something to help us rationalize that. And we came up with a great thing that has paid huge dividends. And we call it race. We call it race. And so I can't see how much time I have left, so let me finish this. So now we're heading towards the home stretch. So I want to get to the meat. So we're kind of warmed up. It's time to kind of get into our next zone. So if we could go to So let's talk about this idea of race. So what is race? Well, one thing we know about race is that it's not biological, right? So there are no particular biological markers that would indicate that one person is of one particular race over another. We know that there are contextual anomalies that develop in genes and in cells that indicate some atmospheric or contextual impact that groups of people have, but never something specifically to race, right? So one of those examples is sickle cell anemia, right? So sickle cell shows up in a lot more brown people than white people or white-skinned people, mostly because of why people developed sickle cell anemia. It was a genetic response to malaria, right? So the trace elements of malaria sparked the need for the body to defend itself, which sickle cell is that defense mechanism. And so that happens in Mediterranean, in arid regions, primarily around the kind of the Mesopotamia Valley, going up into Greece and Italy and that part of the world, right? So North Africa, those places. But it's not race genetic, right? So that's important to recognize. How many people have heard that race is a social construct? Anyone ever heard that? When people say that, what do they mean by that? What is that? Yes, please.
We created it to label people.
So, what's that?
We created it to label people.
We created it to label people. We created it to label people. Interesting. Nobody asked me nothing. Right? So, my mother collected commemorative plates, and one of her proudest plates was 1976, the bicentennial of the United States, and so she gave me this commemorative plate. And she would tell us not to play ball in the house. I don't know if your parents have ever said that, and I don't know if they said it and it fell on deaf ears because you're gonna do it anyway, right? And I don't know why she told us not to. She should have. Well, anyway, so we're playing ball in the house, and we knocked down one of her commemorative plates. There's a problem, right? So she comes home and she sees her commemorative plate broken, and I say, "Mom, mistakes were made." Is that satisfactory to my mother? No. What does she want to know? Who broke my plate? Right? So when we say that race is a social construct, somebody's missing. Who's missing? The constructor, the perpetrator, right? So no longer can we just say that race is a social construct because it becomes the passive voice, right? And we see the passive voice a lot, which is how things and people become invisible, right? Because we don't mention them. A woman was mugged. Who's missing? The person who mugged, right? A war was fought. Who's missing? The actor, right? And so we can't just say that race is a social construct because it's more than that, right? It's more than that. Now, how many folks have their smartphones? Anybody have a smartphone with them? So if you can get your smartphones out, I'm going to have you do some participatory stuff using those great technologies that are in your hand, all right? So So we're going to divide the group into fours, right? So so this is the first half, this is the second half, and then from here forward, we do a group, and then go back and send it, okay? So for this first quarter, what I want you to look up is something called the white codes. I want you to look up something called the white codes. For this quarter, I want you to look up something called the black codes. All right? For this quarter back here, I want you to look up pay equity for men. All pay equity for it. So what is it that that men get paid? Back here, I want you to come up with what women get paid in relationship to men. All right. So what we have to recognize is that race is constructed by governments, right? So a Ford F-150, any place on the planet, is still what? A Ford F-150. Whether it's in Australia, in Germany, in Sweden, in Togo, in South Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Belize, Brazil, Argentina, it doesn't matter. It is the same thing. The same can't be said about race, right? So did you know that there are no Hispanics in Mexico? When do they become Hispanics? When they come here, right? So when we talk about this idea of race, we have to recognize that it is made up by governments. Did you know that the racial and ethnic categories in the United States are not the same as in Canada? And they're not the same as in Mexico or Argentina or Brazil? So race is this tool used by governments to construct things in a particular kind of way. Oftentimes to explain the dissemination of goods, jobs, services, and money. And I'll explain that in just a second. So first let's talk about this idea of white codes. So what are the white codes? What did you come up with white codes?
We came up with hospital codes.
So hospital codes. All right. Code white. All right. Anyone else come up with anything else for white codes? No CSS? No HTML codes? No? Okay. Cool. All right, so let's come over here. Let's talk about black codes. What were the black codes? There were laws passed during the Civil War to what avail? To restrict African Americans' freedom. All right? Laws that were constructed. So on page 2 of your handout, you'll see a list of dates and events, and I apologize, I forgot that I'm over 40 and I need bigger print. So I won't read those, and you can use your magnifying glass and read them yourself. But these are all the tips to get people back into the picture, right? Get back people into the picture. But every step that we've taken, there's also been other things that prevent us from doing that. Now, here is something that I find very interesting. If governments create this idea of race, or they implement this idea of race, where does that happen? How could something like that happen, and where does it happen? It's clear that there have been laws that have restricted access for particular so-called racial groups, right? So the Black Codes is one of those examples where the government itself did that. Redlining is another example of that happening, right? Voter suppression is another example of that, both in the South and in the North. But where does the government do this? Where does the government undertake this kind of work? Well, let's look at the systems itself. I told you earlier I was the affirmative action officer for Anoka County. Part of my responsibility was to make reports to the federal government about our hiring, firing, and advancing policies through something referred to as our affirmative action plan, right? So I'd make these notes, I'd look at all this stuff, and I started to find something very interesting. That when I went to look at the categories, that the government was telling me what the categories already were, right? They were telling me what the categories of race were. And so I could not deviate from that. I just went with what they said. As a result, I get all of this information from the government dictating to me what I should be looking for. How many people have heard someone say, you know what, I'm not going to put my race down because I'm not playing that game? Anyone ever heard someone say something like that? I think it's very interesting when they do that, because there are people who get paid to make sure that box is filled. So if you don't do it, somebody gets paid to make sure that it did, and I happen to be that guy, right? So according to the law, I had to go and make sure that those boxes were filled. As a result, I came to understand that race was this artificial thing. And I'm trying to see yeah. So if you go to page 4,
Just go ahead, take it. While you're
so let's read some of this language coming from the EEO. Employers are required to attempt. Hold up, wait. Required to attempt. What does that mean? It means try, right? It doesn't mean success. It doesn't mean, so anyway. So employers are required to attempt to allow employees to self-identify, to use self-identification in completing the EEO-1 report. If any employee declines to self-identify, employment records or observer identification can be used. Right? This is the law. This is the law. So let's go down to the next part when it talks about race. So what am I looking at for race? Race and ethnic designations as used by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission do not denote scientific definitions of anthropological origins. What does that mean? What are they saying? That our race designations aren't based on what? Science. That darn science. Oh, who needs it, right? So if it's not based on science, what is it based on? We're making it up. We're making it up. So I won't belabor you in reading all of the silliness of our so-called racial categories, but these are our racial categories. One of the things that I think is most egregious is for American Indians. It says that they must have tribal affiliation or community attachment. And I think that is sinister because what were the boarding schools designed to do? To take all of that away. But that's the one thing that the government says defines them. I also find it interesting that Ukrainians, Czechoslovakians, and Russians aren't in any of the so-called racial groups that we have, which lends me to believe that this is politically motivated because for such a long time, those individuals have been the enemy of the United States. And so I think that's an interesting finding. What I also started to think about was who were the orchestrators of the EEO, right? So where do you think EEO lives? Like, where is its home in the government? The Department of Justice is what I thought. It's in the Department of Labor. Where do you think that the census, because that's the other place where we get our so-called racial categories from, where is that housed? In the Department of the Treasury. Which both would indicate that those two concepts are related to what? Money. Money, money, money! If we can't recognize that the slave trade had nothing, let me back up before I make a big mistake, because I don't want to say absolutes, right? That the major consideration for the slave trade was not moral. If we can come to that and say that the major consideration for people doing that was not a moral conviction that people had, that people were less than or they wanted to treat people, but it was motivated by money. And that Africans played a role in that. Africans played a role in that. And so there is no smoking guns to say, well, Africans did it, so it must have been okay. No, it was about making money. And many of those African nations saw the future and said, if we don't trade these human beings for guns, they will come for us too. And many of them regret that to this day. But it makes sense, right? All human behavior is goal-directed, looking for safety, significance, and belonging in whatever way that they can. Right? So let's go to this pay equity. So because sometimes I make these claims and people are like, what are you talking about? You're really out there. So let's talk about this kind of racial equity moves. So I asked people to look for or pay equity stuff, right? So what is the average pay for a man in the metaphor that people typically use? So they start with what? $1, right? So a man makes $1, and what did you come up with in terms of what a woman makes to what a man makes? 75 cents. Can somebody make sure you write that down? Write that down. So man, $1, woman, 70 what? 75 cents. Okay? Cool. So no. That's cool. That's cool. Because I want you to find, what does an African American woman make? So find it. Look that up. So 66 cents. What about a Hispanic woman? 55 cents. What about an Asian woman? Let's come over to the male side. What's an African American man? Just grab one. It's easy. Have a neighbor. Anybody in the room can do it. I'm not limiting. Right? What does an African man make? Well, we'll get to that in just a second. No, African American. 70 cents. So write that down. 70 cents for African American male. Hispanic male. 65 cents. For an Asian male. So $1.17. What does this say to you? So there's tons of disparities. And how are these disparities falling? Along race. And we typically don't like talking about this because we go to
76 cents to the dollar for a man and a woman.
But when we start using a racial equity lens, we start to actually see that the truth is much different than what we're talking about. And so what I'm not asking you to become, raceologists, to see race and everything and study, that's for people like me, right? That's what I do. But what I would encourage you is that as you start looking at policies and procedures, that you start asking, how does this benefit or limit individuals, but also how does it specifically impact particular groups, right? So I was working with a school district, and they were talking about the disciplinary problems, right? And so disproportionately, and they said this, disproportionately, African American males were a part of their disciplinary track, right? But that wasn't good enough for me. That information wasn't good enough for me because I asked, how many of those boys are African American or black? How many of those boys are Somali? How many of those boys are Liberian? Once we started talking about that, then we got to see a different kind of level of interaction that they needed to have by using a racial equity lens. I'm not saying that you need to just become so racialized that that's all you see, but if we don't ask those particular questions, we don't get the kinds of results that we need to be impactful in our work. Right? So there's that. The other, so race is being used as a currency. What I also recognize is that pay equity matrix that we just made, we can find that mirrored in other ways. But the thing that plagues me the most is that we're always comparing blacks to whites. And I wonder why. Because whites aren't doing the best. If we were going to make a comparison to the best, we should be comparing who to who. Everybody to Asian. But that's not what we do, right? And in fact, not all Asians, right? So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. And part of it is because of white supremacy. Now, this is what I want to leave you with, because I'm up for a change. Because if I tried to talk about white supremacy or white privilege in Anoka County, I was getting nowhere. Getting nowhere. So this is what I want you to help me do. I want you to help me talk about white primacy. Primacy. Because white supremacy says that as a white person, I think that I'm the best. But there are tons of white people who don't think that they're the best. Or they don't know they're the best. Ask some folks that I taught in Frogtown. Right? White folks that I taught in Frogtown. So, and they don't feel like they have white privilege. And I'm not going to try to convince them that they do. But I will ask about white primacy. And what primacy means is that I am primary and everything is based off of me. Everything is a reflection of me. Everything is in contrast to me. White primacy. And I think that's more problematic than white supremacy. Because there are tons of white people who wouldn't say that they have white privilege or that they feel superior, but they would say that everything should be a reflection to me. I have a theory about these school shootings. And I don't know if you've noticed a pattern with a number of these school shootings over the last 20 years. Has there been a pattern that's kind of emerged? Young white men. Now here's the interesting thing about that. I believe that these are disaffected young white men who have been sold that they're supposed to have something that they don't have. And as a result, they have not been taught resiliency skills to properly deal with that. Because any of those young men who have been oppressed or bullied, I like to line their bullying up with my bullying that I get every day of my life. But I don't act out in that way. And so one of the things that we also have to recognize is that white is a racial group that needs to be talked about too, in the family of human beings, right? I believe, I'm just going to drop this, I believe that the election of Donald Trump was people saying, with a small c conservative, that change is happening too fast and you have not included us in it, so we will push against it. So no, include them in conservative with a small c, right? Include those folks in how we think and how we talk and how we act, because at the end of the day, we're all human. On page 5, there is a simple diagram that is a self-assessment for you to do. What I want you to do is, not now, but in your own time, is to take this assessment. And basically, the groups on the left are folks who've tried to provide information about other groups across the top. And so those TV, movies, and media, family, friends, school, and workplace have tried to give you information about those groups going across the top. And if that information was positive, I want you to put a plus. If it was negative, I want you to put a minus. If it was never anything that you talked about, I want you to put a 0. And you can have pluses and minuses in the same box, but the size of that plus and the size of that minus will dictate what you know. And I would suggest to you that what you know or you don't know is not your fault. How many of you drive a car? Ridden in a car, right? Does it have a blind spot? And where is that blind spot? It's typically in the blind spot, right? So it's typically over your shoulders. Where else? The front panel, all right? Sometimes in the rear panel. And if you drive a Hummer, the whole thing is a blind spot, right? That is not your fault. However, when you borrow someone's car with a blind spot, when you rent a car with a blind spot, when you buy a car with a blind spot, what are you suggesting about that blind spot?
You figure out where it is and adjust.
I figure out where it is and adjust. I take responsibility for that blind spot. And the only way that you can find a blind spot is to actually look for it. It's the only way you can find it. And then there's this important aspect to the work that I do is impact versus intent, right? So I'm walking down the hall and someone makes a disparaging remark, tells an off-color joke, or is culturally insensitive. What do I do? What's my responsibility? Or what's the organization's responsibility to address that? they have a responsibility to address that, right? And where does that get addressed? In human resources, right? So human resources, they do an investigation and blah, blah, blah. And all that, as this process is going down the pipe, the person says, oh, you can't take a joke. I was just joking. Does that stop the process? Should that stop the human resource process? No, right? So it is about intent. It is about impact. Impact is what we measure, right? Intent is only important when we have a relationship with someone, right? If I'm going to repair that harm, then we focus on intent. Anyone ever given a macaroni sculpture or got an ugly tie or something like that from a wee one, right? Yeah. Why was that accepted? Why was that crummy gift taken in with such grace? Because it was the intention. Because you have a relationship with others. So there's that. Just last couple of things, but kind of blazing through this and ended up talking too long and hanging my hat on some other things. There is this idea of the steeplechase. Is there something wrong with minorities? And I use the word minorities on purpose because that's people who ask these kind of questions use that kind of language. And if your answer is yes, then that says something about the way that you encounter the world. If there is something wrong with them, then we need to get a vaccine to help fix them, right? But if there's nothing wrong with them, then what does that suggest in terms of why people can't achieve, why people can't do the same things that I've done? What might be suggested by the fact that there is nothing wrong with them, that there's a broken system? And so if we pay attention to that system, then we can create those opportunities that give people their liberation. You'll also see three pictures of people at a baseball game. I want to hang my hat on the last picture. What do you notice that is different about the last picture than the other two pictures? The barriers are taken down. And so when we talk about inclusion, what we're not talking about is creating something new or creating something. We're actually talking about what are the unnecessary barriers to human participation and how do we get rid of or lower those. I am not an anarchist. I believe that we need certain structures, but all the structures that we need, all the structures that we have aren't ones that we need. And then lastly, this is the last thing I'll leave you with is the animal farm. And I hear people talk about privilege and people being underprivileged and blah, blah, blah. And it reminds me of my free-range chickens. So I have 8 chickens at my house. We get 2 dozen eggs every day or so. Fun chickens. They get to run around. They're called free-range. And I don't know if you've ever tried to buy either free range or open range eggs or chickens, but those things are what? Expensive. And why are they expensive? Because it's hard to get the eggs. Why else? They need more space. They're running in the sunshine. They're having a good life. They have lots of privilege. But then there are those caged chickens, traditionally raised chickens, right? And how much are those eggs? They're pretty cheap. How much is the chicken? It's pretty cheap chicken, right? Why? Because they're mass produced. They live in close communities with garbage, with drugs in their community because they have to keep the antibiotics so that the chickens will commit chicken on chicken crime in those communities because of their closeness, right? But whether the chicken is a free-range chicken or it is a conventionally raised chicken, what is the destiny of both chickens? To be dinner, right? And so whether we have privilege or we don't have privilege, if we don't keep our eye on the game that is being played in front of us, we will succumb to these obstacle illusions and believe that our race and our ethnicities separate us from other human beings. My name is Andre Koen. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andre. We appreciate you spending some time with us this morning and look forward to building a relationship. Also want to remind everybody about the lunch that is sponsored by Atomic Data. So
so I think it's gonna start shortly.
And Andre, that's what you're doing?
Yeah, I was gonna invite you.
And you guys can eat either in here, you can take chairs out there, but we encourage you to stay here and eat. So we can all get to know each other. There's about 10 people from Atomic here that would like to chat with you and hear some feedback and visit with you about a month.
Thank you.
They are. It's a bridge. It's a
Yeah, that's a good sign. Alright, I think we should have a quick chat. I talked to like your point at the very beginning, reinforce what I've been getting out a lot. So that was really good. I like that. Oh my God, thank you so much. You're like, thank you. Yeah, it's so sweet. I mean, the last picture, I'm like, oh my gosh. How the kiddos? I don't regurgitate things. But it was fabulous. Thank you. That's really great art. So you're going to be. Yeah, well, this is meant for everybody to visit with each other. So turn and face the neighbor and be social. Yeah, good.
Good, good, good.
Are you gonna go to Gracie's wedding?